I was much pleased to learn on my arrival that the company contained a lady, and rejoiced at the prospect of having a female companion on such a long journey. But my hopes were disappointed. I soon found that there could be no congeniality between us. After we had become somewhat acquainted, she in great kindness gave me her advice. "If you have a long dress with you, do put it on for the rest of the trip. The men talk so much about you." "I cannot afford to dress to please their taste," I replied. I could not positively enjoy a moment's happiness with long skirts on, to confine me to the wagon. I then endeavored to explain to her the many advantages which the reform dress possesses over the fashionable one, but failed to make her appreciate my views. Julia Archibald Holmes.
15 June. The Lawrence party reached the Pawnee Fork along the Santa Fe Trail. The dry route was chosen, and the party decided to travel this 50-mile segment over the course of one overnight, followed by a second late night. The moon was a waxing crescent, 4 nights after a new moon.
We now had a stretch of land to pass over of 40 or 50 miles, on which there was ordinarily no water, no wood, nor any good grass. We started an hour or so before sundown and traveled until midnight without resting. Here we halted a half hour and made some coffee over a fire made of wood we had brought from camp the day before. Resuming our journey, we continued traveling until after sunrise in the morning, when we arrived at Coon Creek, which we were glad enough to find was not dry as it generally is. Julia Archibald Holmes.
We spent our evenings visiting each other's tents, jollying each other, telling stories, playing cards, and singing old-fashioned songs such as Nellie Gray, My Old Kentucky Home, Ring Ring the Banjo, and many others. We fancied we had a star quartet of singers and all would join in the chorus. The Wolves often tried to rival our concerts. Jason T. Yonker.
As the train passed the Arkansas crossing, James and I went to the river to see some Santa Fe wagons cross. The river here, perhaps a mile wide, and the bottom one broad bed of sand, with here and there a channel nearly as deep as the cattle's backs. After unloading a part of their freight and placing perishable articles above where the water would enter the wagons, they attached 12 or more yoke of cattle and entered the swift-running river. It was indeed an amusing scene. 20 Mexicans with sharp sticks punching the cattle, shouting and tumbling in the water, the leading cattle continually endeavoring to turn back, the wagon master on horseback swearing in Mexican, now at the cattle, then at the men, creating a wonderful confusion. Julia Archibald Holmes.
June 23. Drove 18 miles. Camped on the river, still no timber. I found a small spring in a ravine of clear water. We got 1 antelope today. It is fine eating. The country is getting rough. Augustus Voorhees.
On the 28th, we reached Bent's Fort, a large structure built by a Mr. Bent for the purpose of trading with the prairie Indians, the Cheyennes in particular. The price paid for a buffalo robe at present is 10 cups of sugar, about 8 pounds. Julia Archibald Holmes.
The fort is built on a bluff near the river, built of sandstone 100 feet wide and 200 long, 13 rooms with a large yard inside. The walls are 16 feet high, the rooms are covered with timber and gravel, a breastwork around the top with portholes for cannon, of which they have 2 pieces. The river is very rapid at this place. Augustus Voorhees.
On arriving at Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River, We found no soldiers, but an Indian trader in possession of the fort. Some of our boys made an inquiry and found the trader had whiskey. We afterwards called it Taos Lightning. After sampling a few pints of the beverage, the boys swore it would kill at 600 yards. We afterward learned the stuff was made by Mexicans at Taos from wheat tramped out by sheep on a dirt floor, and that the wheat and sheep dirt were ground and distilled together to make an extraordinary decoction. Jason T. Yonker.
Up until this time, our company had been remarkably healthy. This afternoon, however, several were taken very ill. Among the sufferers, some of the quasi-moralists who so opposed my mode of dress and women's freedom. One of the actors in this disgraceful occurrence, the 1/4 of which I have not described, an eminent attorney, has since returned to eastern Kansas and written a long letter on the trip in which he stigmatizes strong-minded women and weak-minded men, and greatly fears for the morality of the world on their account. But of such stuff are generally the croakers against reform everywhere. Julia Archibald Holmes.
June 29. Drove 20 miles. Camped on the river. Got an antelope today. Got a glimpse of Spanish Peaks in New Mexico. It is a peak of the Raton Mountains. It looks like a thundercloud. Augustus Voorhees.
We began to look anxiously for a glimpse of Pikes Peak. On the evening of July 3rd, after camping, a sudden rain and hailstorm came upon us, penetrating more or less every wagon cover and blowing down most of the tents. The next morning, we bid farewell to the Arkansas River, whose company we had kept 300 miles. Traveling but 15 miles, the train camped early this evening in order to celebrate the glorious 4th. This was done by consuming what little whiskey remained among the members. This day we obtained the first view of the summit of the peak, now some 70 miles away. As all expected to find precious treasure near this wonderful peak, it is not strange that our eyes were often strained by gazing on it. The summit appeared majestic in the distance, crowned with glistening white. Julia Archibald Holmes.
Yeah, Pikes Peak or bust, you have to go back to what people knew about the Great American Desert, the American West, the Plains. And Pikes Peak, because of the journals that were published as Zebulon Pike, and especially John C. Fremont used the term Pikes Peak to refer to that big mountain that shadows Colorado Springs today. That was a very well-known landmark. So people knew Pikes Peak, and that was a sort of destination, a beacon for these people that were rushing west once gold was discovered. And of course, if you didn't make Pikes Peak, you went bust. So the phrase that often was a rallying cry of these gold seekers was Pikes Peak or bust. I'm going to get there, or I'm going to bust. I'm going to be broken.
We were passing over an uneven road today and getting a mile or two in advance of the wagons. We came upon a pair of antelope grazing. Immediately dropping on the ground that we might not frighten them, we had a fine opportunity to examine their beautiful form and motion. They advanced toward us until they were scarcely 10 rods off, with eyes riveted upon us, perhaps a minute, when sudden as lightning they started and bounded away as like the wind. Their smooth form with slender tapering legs, glossy hair, large eyes, their graceful and intelligent motion left a deep impression of their beauty. Proceeding up the Boiling Springs River, we arrived on July 8th as near as wagons could approach the mountains. Julia Archibald Holmes.
Well, the Ute of course, knew this mountain as Sun Mountain because it was the mountain that collected the sun's rays in the first morning light. And they made this their home also because it was a landmark. These rocks were a beacon for travelers of all types for centuries and centuries and centuries, even up to and including the time that the gold seekers came here.
9 July. 3 men from the Lawrence Party, Frank M. Cobb, John D. Miller, and Augustus Voorhees, began an ascent of Pikes Peak and reached the summit on 10 July. Voorhees wrote, "We got to the top at 3 o'clock, but it was so cloudy we could not see the country beyond. We cut our names on a stick and put it in a pyramid of stones that we piled up." The men mistakenly claimed to be the first persons that ever stood on the summit of Pikes Peak, unaware that Dr. Edwin James and members of Major Stephen Long's expedition had reached the summit 38 years earlier.
Learning from a Mexican that there was a party of white men camped near Soda Springs in the Pikes Peak region, my associate, George Howard, and Mr. Brott and myself decided we'd go with the Indians as far as the Boiling Springs River, then up to the camp near the Soda Springs. We left Green Russell and his party of Georgians at the mouth of Cherry Creek. Arriving at Soda Springs, we found a party of 40 men and 2 women from Lawrence, Kansas, who were also searching for gold. We went into camp with the Lawrence party and remained about a month. In the meantime, we sent out 2 prospecting parties, one under the guidance of a Mexican to go up into the mountains to the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and the other go to South Park by the way of Ute Pass. The party that went to the headwaters of the Arkansas were gone about 15 days and returned with only a sample of iron pyrites, while the party that started to prospect in South Park lost their way and came out of the mountains by the South Platte Canyon. T.C. Dixon.
3 weeks after Cobb, Miller, and Voorhees reached the summit of Pikes Peak, John D. Miller, hoping a second climb would obtain better views with a clear sky, along with George Peck, James H. Holmes, and Mrs. Holmes, dressed in bloomer costume, started a second ascent of the peak.
August 1st. After an early breakfast this morning, my husband and I adjusted our packs and started for the ascent of Pikes Peak. A walk of a mile brought us to the crossing of